Good afternoon and welcome to the first of a series of videos, probably quite a long series of videos about the expeditions of Captain James Cook and the journals thereon. Now, the reason for the series of videos is because this is the subject that has been chosen for the option, the British Studies option at the French exam, the agrégation, which people take in France if they want to become a senior high school teacher. However, this series of videos is not the complete classes which I have taught on this question. This is just going to concentrate on the three expeditions, videos about the first, on the second, on the third, and it's going to follow in more or less chronological order the book of the journals of James Cook in the Penguin Classics edition, which is a much reduced edition compared to the original, which is a huge tome. I've done some classes about the Cook the superhero, and I'm no doubt going to do some more classes about the historical context and the scientific context and so on and so forth. But these videos, at least the first bunch of them, is going about the first expedition, then the second expedition, and the third expedition. So let's get started. Each video should be about half an hour long, and you can see that I have the Endeavour behind me, Captain Cook's ship. Of course, not the original because that rotted away a long time ago. But they built a replica, which is stationed in Australia at the moment, and I was lucky enough to go and see it a couple of years back. I'll come back to that. It's a really quite impressive ship, and when you think that 80-odd men were there for months and months and months, it really is very small indeed, but I'll come back to that. So introducing, first of all, well, let's begin with just the title page there, the first expedition. Now it's kind of traditional to use the word voyage. Captain Cook's voyages, the first voyage, the second voyage, the third voyage. But I've chosen to use expedition because voyage is not a neutral term. You see, voyages are exciting, courageous, adventurous, involving dragons sometimes, or pirates or other such things. But in any case, romanticized. And the whole point about Captain Cook's expeditions is that they are extremely controversial. For some people, they represent the exploratory spirit of the Enlightenment. And for other people, they represent the desire of Europe to take over the rest of the world. And I'm sure my own perspective on this will no doubt be absolutely transparent as the videos go by. But that's not really the point. The main point is to understand from a historical point of view, from a historian's point of view, to understand why Captain Cook has been made a hero for some, and why Captain Cook is seen as a villain by others. And my own personal perspective is that his personal value is not the center of historical exploration, which is not to say that I believe the truth to be somewhere in the middle. So what was the context here? Well, James Cook went off on an exploratory expedition to look for new lands, among other things. In a particular moment of the history of the British Empire. Indeed, the British Empire was in trouble in the United States, yes, in America, and it was going to leave. It was going to lose America in 1776. Although this loss in 1776 was compensated by gains for the empire elsewhere in the world, in particular in India. Here you have India from 1700 to 1785, and you see all the bits in pink were British acquisitions under Clive and Hastings. So basically, and India is huge, and it's a little map, but it's a huge place. So the British Empire was expanding in some places and contracting in others. So it was expanding in India in particular, and it was contracting in the sense that it lost America because of the Declaration of Independence in 1776. And Australia and New Zealand, which are an important part of Cook's expedition, will come to bolster the British Empire and to build up the British Empire, the colonization of Australia and New Zealand will happen a number of years after the expeditions of James Cook. Indeed, the first fleets, and that's often capital F, a couple of capital F's, very important, arrived in Australia to found. There were 1,500 people on it. And it was arrived in Australia to found a penal colony, a prison. Yeah, the French already had one in New Caledonia, and so the British were looking around for somewhere distant to send criminals. Although remember, at the time you could be transported off to Australia for stealing some food. It was Joseph Banks, one of James Cook's friends and companion on the first of the expeditions, who suggested, if I remember correctly, oh well, that place in New Holland, which will later be called Australia, where Botany Bay, where we turned up, which is now near Sydney, that would be a good place for a penal colony. And so off went the first fleet of 1788. And this in Australian history has become quite a symbolic moment, because the first group of British people who arrive in Australia intending to stay, to colonize the place, and as you can imagine, nobody really asked the opinions of the Aborigines, to say the least. And here in this picture, you see this is a museum in Sydney. And they have a whole series of models of some of the ships that made up the first fleet. So it's been presented, perhaps not openly as glorious, but almost as certainly as something to be fascinating and proud about the first fleet, which of course remains politically very controversial, because, you know, is it the beginning of the wonders of Australia, or is it the beginning of the massacre of the Aboriginals? 1788 was then the takeover of the beginnings of the takeover of Australia. It took a long time, whereas in 1840 British sovereignty was proclaimed over the whole of New Zealand, and New Zealand was important to Cook's first expedition because he went all the way around it to make a complete map. So there we are. And so New Zealand and Australia at the beginning of the 19th, end of the 18th century, beginning of the 19th century, were important moments of the reinforcement of the British Empire. Continuing through the 19th century, the British made enormous conquests in Africa. And in the 20th century, it became clear after the First World War that Britain was no longer really a superpower. She was faced with rising rebellion in India under the leadership of Gandhi. And once India won its independence in 1947, it seemed that the writing was on the wall for the British Empire. Indeed, from 1960 on, dozens of colonies in Africa, in the Caribbean, and in Asia gained their independence, while after the Suez Crisis of 1956, the British elite had to accept that the United States was really the boss. So that little potted history of the British Empire, because Cook is sometimes treated as an imperial hero, as a hero of the British Empire, and certainly on some of the statues, that's what it says at the bottom in the inscription. Today, however, when people talk about James Cook, well, unabashedly praising the British Empire has become a much more difficult project, given, one, its collapse, and two, the rise of a more generalized consciousness of the massacres and exploitation involved in its history. So today, James Cook, is sometimes defended as another kind of hero, as an individual hero, rather than as a representative of empire. He is said to have been characterized by exceptional bravery, initiative, intelligence, managerial capacity, and each period creates the heroes that they need. And so we almost see James Cook as fitting in with the late capitalist ideal of the disruptive entrepreneur. Think of the founders of Amazon and Facebook. There you have James Cook at the top and Bill Gates at the bottom. Are they similar, coming up with new ideas, breaking the mold, and becoming very rich and famous? Perhaps. Let us then go back before the first expedition of Cook and look at some of a very brief presentation of a few previous explorers. Of course, the most famous of all is Christopher Columbus, arriving in 1492 in the Americas, and making a huge difference for Spain. But even before Columbus, the Portuguese had been working quite hard at traveling around to distant places. Indeed, the Portuguese had visited much of Africa. Now, Africa is bigger than it appears on the maps, and of course, even today, but well, no, not today, you have aeroplanes, but it was much quicker to go around it in a ship than to go across land. So in 1484, the Portuguese arrived in the Congo. In 1488, they arrived at the Cape of Good Hope, yes, so the very point at the south of Africa. In 1498, they arrived in India, going round Africa. And in 1542, they arrived in Japan. And here we have, in fact, a later 17th century representation by Japanese artists of the arrival of a Portuguese ship. So the Portuguese were the most impressive explorers, if you like, obviously looking for places to dominate, but still the most impressive explorers in the 15th century. And in the 16th century, it seemed it was the Spanish, with the aftermath of Columbus. And in the 17th century, the Dutch. The Dutch made maps of the coast of New Holland, Australia. Remember, James Cook was absolutely not the first European to get to Australia. In particular, there was a whole number of Dutch explorers, but I only want to mention one. And this is Tasman, Abel Tasman, and you recognize his name because he still today his name is on the island of Tasmania. And indeed, Tasman did see New Zealand and met the Maoris, although if I remember correctly, he didn't land. He had a bit of a fight with the Maoris and then disappeared. And indeed, here is a very early drawing of Tasman meeting the Maori in 1642. So we're a long way before Cook, but then the Australians and the New Zealanders will be left alone for a very long time until Cook. And one of the reasons that Cook was that it was the British who got out there next is because the British Empire was on the rise, and one of the things is that they were making better and better ships. The technology of ship making, the British were at the front of this at the time. When Tasman went down to New Holland, which will later be called Australia, and New Zealand, which of course was not called New Zealand yet. Again, Zealand is a province of Holland. Yeah, it's all named after the Dutch. So it's certainly in Britain we forgot that the Dutch went there, and we assumed that when I was at school, I was taught that James Cook discovered Australia. Yeah. Now then, why were people going exploring that south? I mean, first of all, it has to be remembered that it was extremely dangerous, and when people present Cook and his crew as very brave people, there are some elements of truth in this, and it was very dangerous. But perhaps Cook's crew were motivated by the fact that, firstly, on board ship, you would definitely you would get well fed. Most people at home were often hungry, and secondly, I think they probably were all just in favor of adventure. And when they got home, if they got home, then they could tell the most amazing of stories to people who had hardly left their town, because that was often the situation in the 18th century. In any case, as they went south, whether it be Tasman or Cook, as they went south, they were tremendously interested in the great southern continent. The great southern continent had been imagined from the 2nd century by Ptolemy, who was also a great astronomer, who imagined Terra Australis. And a Dutch explorer, Jacob, had already been to look for this in 1702. Now, he wasn't likely to find it because, spoiler, the great southern continent does not exist. However, many people thought that it did exist. And the reason they thought that it did exist was not because they'd seen it, because of course nobody had been there. It was based on the idea that continental land in the northern hemisphere, in particular Eurasia, Europe and Asia, this enormous mass of land, should be balanced by land in the southern hemisphere. This theory of balancing land has been documented as early as the 5th century. So that was the idea, is that the Terra Australis must exist to balance, and it must be huge. And just like when the Spanish had got to South America first, they made a huge amount of money and riches from it, and the Portuguese too. Brazil was a tremendous source of riches for Portugal. Well, so the Dutch and then the English, when they were down south looking for the Terra Australis Incognita, the unknown southern continent, they were hoping that their country would become gain tremendous riches from this place. So it was going to be well worth spending a long time looking at it. Notice that this Terra Australis is not Australia. It's not Australia. It's another. Australia was called New Holland at that time, incidentally, but it's another continent which doesn't exist, which is supposed to be much bigger than Australia and further south. Now, it is only in the 19th century that the word, the name New Holland for what we today know as Australia disappeared, and the colonial authorities in Sydney decided to call Australia. And the South Polar continent was eventually named Antarctica in the 1890s, but the South Polar continent is much smaller and much less inhabited than the great southern continent that they imagined. Yes, it was the British explorer Matthew Flinders, who is well known for having crossed Australia, which is quite difficult, who decided that it would be better to call Australia because they were unlikely now to find a huge southern continent. So let's keep talking about the southern continent that they imagined happened. Well, here we have, a 1570 map, for example, and you can see there's the great southern continent in the south, not very far from the south of Africa, not very far from the south of South America, and absolutely ginormous and obviously full of riches, because if you've never seen it, there's no point in imagining it as being poor, is there? And so this is very interesting. You can see that at this time, you know, if they weren't worried about excessive accuracy, if they didn't know something, they just made it up, yeah. And there are many maps of this sort. Now, Dalrymple, who was an important marine man in at the time of Cook, and indeed would have liked to be the skipper of Cook's expedition instead of Cook, but was not successful, wrote about the southern continent in 1770. And what did he say? He said, the number of inhabitants in the southern continent is probably more than 50 million, considering the extent from the eastern part discovered by Juan Fernandez to the western coast seen by Tasman. Is about 100 degrees of longitude, which in the latitude of 40 degrees amounts to 4,596 geographic or 5,323 stature miles. This is a greater extent than the whole civilized part of Asia from Turkey to the eastern extremity of China. There is at present no trade from Europe thither, though the scraps from this table would be sufficient to maintain the power, dominion, and sovereignty of Britain by employing all its manufacturers and ships. Now, Britain is already beginning its first industrial revolution based on canals, which make it much easier to transport goods and therefore make it worthwhile making much larger quantities of goods, and also the iron industry, in particular in Wales, is becoming important. So obviously not important like the 20th century, but it's becoming important. And one of the reasons that they would quite like to find a southern continent, because if they could have the monopoly of trade, this would be a huge amount of money. So you can see that he was convinced that there were a lot of people there, and that it was absolutely huge. Now, a number of people had seen places. For example, Tasman saw New Zealand, and he didn't know that New Zealand was an island. He imagined that New Zealand was just the tip of the huge southern continent. So everyone was very excited about this and about going to see it. Now, in 1768. It was suggested that this Dalrymple should be the person who should lead the expedition which was to be sent to the Pacific to observe the transit of Venus. But he was not a military man, and he insisted that he only wanted to go if he was the captain. And the Admiralty, the head of the leaders of the Navy, then were not having this, and therefore Dalrymple did not captain the ship, and Cook did. But in any case, to go back to the history of exploration in the Pacific, in the Pacific, in 1722, I missed out one key moment when Roggeveen, obviously a Dutch person, found Easter Island. Everybody knows Easter Island because it's got those enormous, impressive statues, which is why we don't forget it. It's called Easter Island because he found it at Easter. And also, Mr. Bering found the Bering Straits right in the north, right in the very north, which is still called the Bering Straits today. So here you have then an 18th century context with some European powers in great competition, hoping to explore new places before another country does, and they're all hoping to use this cunning use of flags, as Eddie Izzard says, a comedian, that is this idea that if you arrive in a place where no other Christians have been, and you put the flag down and you say, I named this place such and such a place, and I claim it in the name of the king, and this is something which was enough. Of course, it helps if you have guns and the others don't. So they were about to. There's another map then, the 1578 map. One of my teacher dreams has always been to use my holiday photos as illustrations for my lessons. And here I was lucky enough to go to Sydney, and behind me is the replica, full-size, exact replica of Captain Cook's first ship, Endeavour. So you've got all these European countries obviously convinced of the superiority of European civilization and how wonderful it would be to the people living on southern islands and isolated places, how wonderful it would be for them to be visited by us, and they're about to set off on these fabulous adventures. And there we go. Then there is the map of Cook's very first expedition, 1768 to 71. And I'm going to continue talking about this in the second video, which will be available probably in a week or two's time. Thank you for listening.